A tie is one of the strangest objects a serious adult can voluntarily attach to their neck. It does not keep them warm unless the neck was facing a very specific weather emergency. It does not protect the body. It does not hold the shirt together in any meaningful way. And yet, somehow, the moment it appears, the same shirt starts looking more official. Nothing practical has changed. The fabric is still just hanging there, basically a vertical flag for "I understand this room has rules." Which raises a strange question. If the tie is not solving a clothing problem, what problem is it solving? The tie only works because the room is already in on the joke. In an office, it can say professionalism. At a wedding, it can say respect. In a court, school, interview, or parliament, it can say something slightly different, depending on who built the rules and who is expected to obey them. Same fabric strip, different social password. That is the important part. The meaning is not sitting inside the tie like a tiny professional ghost. It comes from the shared code around it. A tie works when everyone in the room has been taught, openly or quietly, what that dangling signal is supposed to mean. That sounds like the answer, but codes usually come from somewhere, and this one begins in a place that does not look corporate at all. Codes usually start looking less mysterious when you follow them backward, not to a boardroom, to 17th century soldiers. In the French army under Louis XIV, Croatian soldiers were known for wearing scarves around their necks. French observers connected that look with Croatians, and the word cravat grew from that connection. This sounds like the neat origin story. It is not neat. Clothing history almost never has the decency to behave like a product launch. The important part is movement. From soldiers to the French court to elite European dress, a neck scarf became fashionable because powerful people learned how to read it. Not as the modern tie yet, but as an ancestor with very good social connections. But military origin still leaves a harder question. Why did something near the neck become a symbol of control? Then the neckwear story gets stiffer. Literally stiffer. By the 19th century, military neck stocks could turn fabric near the throat into posture equipment. Some were rigid enough to keep the head high and the body visibly controlled. Not because soldiers needed their necks decorated, because the neck is a very useful place to announce discipline. It is visible, it shapes posture, and it sits right between the face and the uniform. So a controlled neck could make a controlled person look more believable. That is the uncomfortable little bridge. Neckwear was not only fashion and not only warmth. It could become a public sign that the body had accepted rules. But if we stop at soldiers and discipline, the story becomes too clean. And clothing history gets suspicious when it becomes too clean. Because somewhere along the way, neckwear stopped looking only like control and started looking like taste. This is where Beau Brummel enters the room, calmly, correctly, and probably judging everyone's caller. In elite men's fashion, the loud aristocratic costume began losing ground to darker tailored clothes, white linen, and one precise little battlefield at the neck. The cravat, not useful in the way a coat is useful. Useful because it proved you had time, restraint, cleanliness, and enough patience to obey invisible rules before breakfast. There was even an 1818 satirical book called Neckcloth Titania, because apparently tying fabric around your neck had become complicated enough to need comedy paperwork. That is the strangest part. The uselessness was not a flaw, it was the point. Now neckwear had status and ritual, but to become the modern tie, it still needed a shape that could survive ordinary daily life. So neckwear had status, ritual, and a suspicious amount of social pressure. But it still had one practical problem. It had to become boring enough to wear every day. In the 1850s, the long vertical four-in-hand tie began as young men's sporting attire, not exactly the birthplace you expect for office seriousness. But within about a decade, that longer shape had spread. The name four-in-hand has a few possible origin stories, which is history's way of saying, please enjoy the fog. The important part is the shape, a long strip tied at the neck, hanging down the front, readable from across a room. Then, in 1922, Jesse E. Langsdorff filed a patent for improvements to four-in-hand ties. It was granted in 1923, and the key idea was construction, cutting the fabric so the tie could hang from the knot without twisting. That sounds small, but for a social signal, hanging correctly matters. The modern tie was not failed clothing anymore. It was a signal pretending to be clothing engineered to stay readable. That explains how the tie became stable. But stability alone does not make people trust the person wearing it. A straight tie is easy to read, but that still does not explain why anyone believes the reading. For that, We need to talk about a very rude human habit. People judge surfaces fast. Clothing researchers describe dress as part of person perception, which sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Before someone speaks, people are already guessing identity, role, status, traits, and even what kind of mind they are dealing with. Basically, your outfit becomes metadata, a tiny social file attached to your body, which is unfair, efficient, and extremely human. Princeton researchers found that subtle clothing cues linked to wealth could change perceived competence almost instantly, even when the faces were identical, even when the exposure was extremely brief. And in a 2023 study, casual attire was perceived as less ethical than business casual or business formal attire. Not less ethical in reality, perceived that way, which is exactly the problem. The tie works because humans are already scanning the surface, and the tie gives the surface something very easy to scan. If clothes can change how others judge us, the next question becomes stranger. Can formal clothing also change how we judge ourselves? If the tie is a signal to the room, it can also become a signal to the person wearing it. That is where the object gets annoying. In 2015, a series of 5 studies linked formal clothing with more abstract big-picture thinking. Partly, researchers argued because formal dress can create psychological social distance. The term sounds technical. The idea is simple. When people dress for a role, they may start standing a little farther from the immediate mess and closer to the big picture version of themselves. Professional, official, careful, serious, or at least doing a convincing impression of serious. Not because the tie is magic, because it belongs to a costume system that tells your brain this is the mode we are in now. And if the tie can shape how others read you, and maybe how you read yourself, the next question gets uncomfortable. Why are so many rooms letting it go? If the tie can do all that, the obvious question is why so many rooms are now backing away from it. Because a signal only works while the room still wants that exact signal. In Japan, the 2005 Cool Biz campaign made the anti-tie argument painfully practical. Offices were encouraged to set air conditioning to 28 degrees Celsius and let workers skip jackets and ties in summer. Suddenly, the tie was not just tradition. It was heat wrapped around your neck with a small knot of unnecessary suffering. Japan's Environment Ministry reported that Cool Biz avoided about 1.14 million tons of cow ecine in 2006. So yes, in one context, removing the tie became climate policy. In the UK House of Commons, business-like attire now need not include a tie. That is a quiet rule change, but quiet rule changes are how old symbols start losing their furniture. And in 2021, New Zealand's parliament dropped its male tie requirement after Rawiri Watiti was ejected for wearing a heitiki instead of a tie. He called the tie a colonial noose. The point is not that every tie means oppression, or every no-tie room means freedom. The point is stranger. The same strip can mean respect in one room, heat, hierarchy, exclusion, or outdated authority in another. The old rule is weakening, but the object has not vanished, which means the tie did not simply die. It changed jobs. No funeral. No tiny black armband for the black necktie. It mostly lost its job as the automatic office uniform. In 2023, Dallin found that U.S. workers were more likely to wear business casual, street clothes, or uniforms than anything like old formal office dress. The numbers were blunt: 41% business casual, 31% street clothes, and 23% uniforms. In the UK, YouGov found that only 7% of workers said they wore business attire. So the tie stopped being the default password in many everyday workplaces, but that does not mean it became meaningless. Fashion reporting has described ties fading in corporate districts while reappearing among younger people as deliberate style statements. That is the mutation. Once the tie is no longer required, wearing one can become more intentional. So the final answer cannot be just tradition or just fashion, because the real question is why a useless object can still carry this much information. So the tie survives for a reason that sounds ridiculous until you notice how humans behave. It is readable, not warm, not protective, not useful in the coat and boot sense. Useful because it turns invisible information into something the room can see. I know the code. I accept the role. I belong here. Or, in a newer version, I know the symbol well enough to play with it. That is why the original question is too small. Humans do not only wear clothes for bodies, they wear them for other humans. So the next time someone tightens a tie before a meeting, ceremony, interview, or any other room with rules, they are probably not doing it because their neck needed emotional support. They are putting on a visible agreement with the room. The fabric strip is new-ish, the signal is old, and the need to be readable to other humans is older than the tie ever was.